the pages of the book translucent and clear like they were made of jade, perfectly square, and suffused with an indescribable solemn, ancient and icy cold aura. On the other hand, there were two large words inscribed with forceful strokes on the front of the book. Netherworld Register. OM. At this instant, the Netherworld Register had suddenly opened up. The heavens and the earth were overturned, and it seemed like a new era and a cycle of reincarnation had been started. The first scene had appeared was that of an expanse of flaming flowers that were dazzling like blood. They covered the surrounding space as they swayed about, and they were bright red, brilliant, and emanated an indescribable strand of energy that could take the soul away. The ocean of Paramitha flowers. The Paramitha flowers were also called red spider lilies, or the flowers of hell that guided the souls of the dead to the netherworld. Paramitha was one of the supreme laws of the netherworld. At this instant, the Paramitha flowers bloomed throughout the heavens and the earth. They were red like an ocean of blood, and it seemed like the door to the netherworld had been opened. It was an extremely shocking scene. That lethal attack Arui executed was extraordinarily terrifying. However, as soon as it came into contact with the ocean of Paramitha flowers, it had melted like snow in water, and it instantly vanished without cause the slightest ripple. All of this took some time to describe but was actually completed in an instant. No one had expected that such a world-shocking scene would have actually appeared at this critical moment. An expanse of dazzling blood-red flowers had actually appeared soundlessly and dispersed Arui's lethal attack. Arui's expression changed slightly while he revealed a rare wisp of terror in his eyes. Paramitha Dao Insight. The path illuminated by fire. That's... The figures of Shi Yu and the others had stopped abruptly. They'd originally intended to charge onto the shaman spirit sacrificial altar to rescue Xianxia. Yet never had they imagined that such a turn of events would actually occur at this critical moment. What's that? The energy of Paramitha? Shi Yu and the others were horrified, and their figures stiffened on the spot. Paramitha has appeared and samsara is within reach. Jianan's heart shook and was unable to calm down for a long time. At this instant, the prophecy that the Buddha had left behind all those years ago seemed to be reverberating in his ears. The last days resides in the grand abyss. The karmic tribulation of samsara rises. The surroundings were deathly silent. It seemed like the heavens and the earth were illuminated by the Paramitha flowers and were dyed brilliant red. It was a scene that emanated a horrifying aura. At this moment, Xianxia's entire body was bathed on blood and on the verge of falling apart. However, his eyes were still bright, indifferent, and cold. It was like he'd become a completely different person. The Netherworld Register was glowing brightly in front of him, and it emanated a solemn and icy cold aura that was obscure like an abyss and unfathomable. It caused his imposing aura to change completely, and he revealed a dignified and grand aura that struck directly at the heart. It was like he'd lost all emotions and transformed into a supreme god that ruled over the netherworld, stood proudly through the passage of time, and was looking down upon the world. Thump! Arui's heart shook. The unexpected event that he was most unwilling to see happen had still occurred in the end. He didn't have the time to feel regret, and he practically instinctively emanated a myriad of strands of divine light as he shouted loudly and attacked once more with the divine sword of the shamans in his hand. Bang! At this moment, the images of numerous ancient and mighty figures had appeared around his sword, and they were like extraordinary shamans who were from the last era. They chanted an obscure shaman chant that resounded through the world and emanated boundless might that converged completely onto the sword. Crack! Crack! At this moment, the ground of the shaman spirit sacrificial altar seemed to be unable to endure the might converged within the sword, and it started to crack apart while space shook. Everything was being crushed by the vast energy within the sword. The might of this attack was actually much even more terrifying than before. It caused Shi Yu and the others to shudder with fear while their countenance instantly turned ghastly pale. Moreover, a strand of terror that couldn't be restrained had arisen in their hearts, and it made them truly wish for nothing more than to turn around and flee. Die! Arui shouted loudly with an arrogant bearing, and his might was violent and boundless. He simply seemed to intend to rely on this attack to forcefully create a new expanse of the heavens and the earth. However, no one knew that a wisp of horror which couldn't be eliminated had arisen in Arui's heart. She still stood there on the spot without moving. He seemed as if he hadn't noticed everything that was occurring in his surroundings, and only his eyes were gazing indifferently at Arui, who resided in the distance. On the other hand, when Arui had executed this attack, another page of the Netherworld Register had flipped open. In an instant, the ocean of Permetha flowers had vanished, and it was replaced by a vast and seemingly boundless sea that was extremely muddy. The sea was vast and filled with the energy of oblivion. It seemed like countless fiend gods were roaring and innumerable sages were howling with sorrow from within the sea because they were eternally suppressed there and unable to escape. The sea of misery. Attaining enlightenment was the only way out of the sea of misery. So, once one fell into it, it was equivalent to eternal damnation. Shockingly, this was the second supreme Grand Tao within the Netherworld, the Grand Tao of Oblivion. Bang! An astounding scene that could shock the world appeared. The attack Arui executed was originally enshrouded by numerous mighty figures. However, as soon as it entered into the sea of misery, it was forcefully suppressed by an invisible force, and it sunk completely into the depths of the sea. They howled and struggled, but it was in vain in the end. On the other hand, the energy that filled Arui's attack had practically been instantly crushed by the ceaseless impact of the sea of misery, and it was dispersed into nothingness. It was even to the extent that if Arui hadn't evaded in time, then he would have almost been trapped within the vast sea of misery. This was extremely inconceivable. She had clearly just advanced into the ranks of Region Lords, while Arui already possessed a strength that wasn't inferior to a 9th-star Region Lord. Earlier, he'd even crushed Xianxia with absolute strength to the point she couldn't even withstand his attacks and had almost suffered calamity. Yet now, the situation had suddenly turned around. Arui's attacks were even more terrifying than before, and he'd even aroused killing intent and stopped holding back. However, he was actually obstructed over and over again. Not only was he unable to harm Xianxia, he'd almost been struck by Xianxia's attack instead. If all of this hadn't happened before their very eyes, Yu and the others would almost be unable to believe it. But in next to no time, they determined that all of these unexpected events had occurred because of that book which floated in front of Xianxia. The Netherworld Register. It was a supreme treasure that was left behind by the third Netherworld Emperor, but it was revealing its might at this moment. So, could it be that it was an omen of something? Oblivion. Arui's voice seemed as if it was squeezed out from his chest, and it carried shock, rage, disbelief, and extreme fear. When compared to the calm and composed appearance he had just now, Arui's current display was extremely unusual. He was restless, uneasy, shocked, and furious. Moreover, he seemed to be fearing something. Kill! Arui practically didn't hesitate to attack once more. At this moment, his entire body seemed as if it was on fire. Divine light shot into the sky while his entire body seemed as if it had transformed into the body of God, and he emanated an extraordinarily majestic aura. On the other hand, the sword in his hand emanated waves of ear-piercing rumbling that shook the 9 heavens, and its might was activated to its limits. Yes, at this moment, Arui hadn't held back at all, and he'd exerted all his strength in this attack. Bang! The heavens collapsed. Bang! The earth split apart. Bang! Everywhere this attack passed, it seemed to have blasted open boundless space and traversed the annals of time. It carried a brilliant, imposing aura that was seemingly heroic. At this moment, Yu and the others wondered if the real end of the world had descended because everything seemed to be drowned in great calamity, and everything had been transformed into nothingness. Swish! Suddenly, a wisp of the glow of sunset surged into appearance. It spread incessantly through the world, and it covered everything in the tragic and moving color of twilight. On the other hand, the Netherworld Register that floated in front of she seemed like the blood-red sun during sunset, and it caused space, light, and everything else to fall into the end of its existence. At this moment, Xi's entire body was still bathed in blood and on the verge of falling to pieces. However, his entire body was enveloped by a wisp of an extremely dense aura of sunset. He stood amidst the twilight with the sunset as his crown, and the space between his brows was filled with a solemn and indifferent expression. The glow of sunset seemed to have torn the light and darkness apart. It dyed everything in the color of twilight, and it was a grand, magnificent, and desolate scene. Terminus, the sunset of the gods. This force wasn't just terrifying, it seemed to be capable of putting an end to time, bringing the universe to the end, and making all forces and lives fall to judgment. After the sunset was eternal silence and darkness, and it was prepared for the establishment of the new beginning at dawn. Bang! An explosion resounded. As soon as Arui's divine sword of the shamans was dyed by a wisp of the glow of sunset, it actually cracked inch by inch before transforming into nothingness. Bang! On the other hand, Arui seemed as if he'd been struck by lightning. His figure was blasted flying, and he coughed up blood while revealing a wisp of astonishment on his face. His full-force attack had actually been mercilessly crushed beneath the glow of sunset. This was the energy of Terminus. It was the core that formed Samsara. Early on during the primeval times of the three dimensions, countless rains of blood had been caused because of this taboo, and it caused the great figures of the various worlds to be infuriated. In the end, it came to an end with the death of the third Netherworld Emperor. Since then, this taboo had been obliterated in the annals of time, and it had never again appeared in the world. However, no one had imagined that the sunset of the gods would appear once more at this moment. At this instant, Shiryu and the others were dumbstruck while their hearts were drowned in shock. Jianan's lips trembled slightly as he muttered repeatedly, "It's really coming true. It's really coming true. Impossible! Impossible! The last days are coming, and Samsara has ceased to exist for a very long time. It's absolutely impossible for you to possess the energy of Samsara." Arui roared loudly in a distressed tone. His face had warped while his hair was disheveled, and his voice carried extreme hatred and terror. At this moment, he seemed as if he'd gone mad and was unable to accept everything that had occurred before him. However, no matter how furious he was, he didn't dare approach Xianxia at all and enter the area covered in the glow of sunset. It seemed as if danger that could threaten his life existed amidst the glow of sunset. But even if Arui didn't dare attack, the Netherworld Register was still undergoing changes. It was ceaselessly revealing various phenomena that were strange and unusual. A path illuminated by fire that was brilliant and blood-red, a boundlessly vast muddy sea of misery, the 6 paths that were in perfect order, the hall that judged good and evil, the 18 levels of hell that were filled with boundless sin. They were so breathtaking, so horrifying. In the end, the Netherworld Register had flipped to the last page. However, the last page was empty. It seemed extremely unexpected. It was completely empty, and it caused others to feel a strand of disappointment. It's empty? What does that mean? Ha ha ha! Where's Samsara? Samsara has ceased to exist since a very long time ago. Without Samsara, all your struggles have been in vain. When he witnessed this scene, Arui, who originally seemed to have gone mad, was briefly stunned before he suddenly roared with laughter, and he seemed like a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulder while the terror in his heart had been wiped away. Moreover, the gaze he shot at Xianxia had become icy cold and cruel once more. Huh? Shiryu and the others were astounded while they cried out in their hearts. Shit! Jianan was stunned while he started deducing madly in his heart. How could it be like that? At this moment, Xianxia, who'd been standing motionlessly on the spot until now, seemed to have awakened from his deathly silence. He stretched out his right arm, and a pitch-black and icy-cold brush that was suffused with an obscure glow had suddenly appeared in his palm. After that, he gently lowered the tip of the brush onto the last and empty page of the Netherworld Register. The Condemn Evil brush. The tip of the brush was like a blade, and it was suffused with an illusory glow. When it came into contact with the last page of the Netherworld Register that was completely blank, a strand of an indescribable force suddenly effused out from the tip of the brush. After that, he dragged a strike down. It was like a bolt of lightning that was branded on that empty page, and it emanated a unique aura. This stroke was like a key that opened the door to samsara. In an instant, the entire shaman spirit sacrificial altar fell into an indescribably solemn, dignified, and deathly silent atmosphere. The world was silence. Space had frozen. It seemed like everything had stopped at this instant. Arui's roaring laughter had stopped abruptly along with this. His entire body seemed like a restrained wooden puppet that was stunned on the spot. His pupils had dilated while his face had stiffened, and the space between his brows was filled with astonishment. He wanted to make a sound yet was unable to open his lips anymore. He wanted to struggle yet noticed that this strength had been restrained by a mysterious force field, and he was actually unable to lift even a finger. It was even to the extent that his senses had been chained down and were powerless to charge out from his mind. At this moment, Arui could only look helplessly into the distance. He was unable to control himself anymore, and it seemed like his fate wasn't in his control anymore. A strand of great terror suddenly arose within his heart, and it swept throughout his body like a cold torrent that made it feel like the blood within his entire body had frozen. He fell into an indescribable state of horror. This is impossible. This is impossible. Arui was roaring in his heart. He seemed like a prisoner that was on the verge of death. He was roaring with despair within a boundless abyss, and his voice carried boundless terror and unwillingness. Shiryu and the others were stunned as well, and it was like they'd been scared out of their wits. The emotions of existences at their level of cultivation had stopped being influenced by external factors. Yet now, a wisp of shock firmly occupied a place in their hearts. They were unable to explain the reason for this, and they just felt like this expanse of the heavens and the earth was about to undergo a shocking change in Xianxia's hands. Moreover, this shocking change was something that they'd absolutely not experienced since they'd started cultivating until now. Jianan seemed like he was happy yet wasn't, and seemed like he was sorrowful yet wasn't. It was an extremely strange expression as he muttered, and even he didn't know what he was saying. It's here. It's finally going to come true. After so many eras and countless years of time, it's finally going to appear in the world. 9 really is the end of numbers. The Buddha never deceives me. Hiss, hiss. Amidst this atmosphere where everything was motionless and deathly silent, only Chun 11 was moving. The condemn evil brush in his hand seemed like it was held by the hand of the heavens, and he drew mark after mark on the blank page at the end of the netherworld register. The marks were clean and ordinary, yet they were smooth like flowing water. Moreover, they emanated a unique and supreme aura that didn't seem like something from this world. When they gradually appeared on the blank page, numerous phenomena started to appear as well. There was the path illuminated by fire, the sea of misery, the sunset of terminus, the 6 paths, the 18th levels of hell, the path of no return in hell, Granny Meng's hall of judgment. These phenomena overlapped and fused together incessantly as they converged on the blank page, and they condensed into numerous strokes that were created by the condemn evil brush. Moreover, as this was being carried out, the atmosphere in the heavens and the earth grew even more deathly silent and solemn, and it exerted a boundless deterrent force onto the hearts of all. It was too terrifying. At this moment no one could move anymore. Shiryu and the others couldn't, Jianan couldn't, and even Arui, whose strength was comparable to a 9th-star region lord, was unable to move as well. It was even to the extent that anyone who was here would probably be powerless to do anything. What sort of atmosphere was this? It was an atmosphere filled with a great dignified aura within the aura of great terror. And there was a great imposing aura within the great dignified aura as well. No one dared to be disrespectful to it, and it was an unprecedented scene. OM. Suddenly, the condemn evil brush in Xianxia's hand stopped moving, and he moved it away from the last page of the netherworld register. At the same time, a strange and mysterious ripple of force swept out. In an instant, an extraordinarily shocking scene appeared. The eternal annals of time, the alternation of all things, the past, the present. Everything seemed to have entered into a state of being rebuilt and transformed. It felt like they were standing at the end of time, and they were looking down at the star and moon descending while the rivers flowed. Samsara. How could that damnable samsara have appeared? Why? Why? At this moment, Arui somehow got the strength to shout loudly with shock, rage, and horror. But in merely an instant, his entire body underwent a transformation like he'd fallen into the cycle of reincarnation. His skin, spirit, energy, essence, and even strength were declining sharply. It was like the time he'd experienced was being turned around, and the energy he possessed was being recalled. Moreover, the life he possessed seemed to be returning to its source. In a short period of a few breaths of time, Arui's entire body had transformed into the body of a young child, and his face was covered in a dazed expression. His experiences were gone, his strength had vanished, and his memory had returned too far back in time. At this moment, he was just a young boy. He couldn't remember everything that was before him, and he felt a dazed and empty feeling from inside out. This was extremely terrifying. He was clearly before a formidable enemy of his, yet he'd forgotten everything and returned to his youth. He clearly possessed a strength that was comparable to a ninth-star region lord, yet his strength had flowed away completely, and he'd become extremely weak. His glory, memory, experiences, and even the secrets hidden in the depths of his heart had transformed into nothingness during this unexpected and shocking change. How pitiable was all of this? He hadn't even accomplished his wishes, yet everything had instantly transformed into nothingness. This was simply crueler than killing someone. At the very least, one would know who his enemy was before death, and one could still feel anger, still feel resentment, and still have regrets. Yet now it was like everything had been evaporated. This wasn't a reversal of time because time was unable to take memories and experiences away. This wasn't a path of reincarnation to rebuild oneself because one's memories and experiences would be sealed up and preserved before the reincarnation. This was samsara, the cycle of reincarnation. It was a supreme Tao that was formed by the three supreme grand Taos of Paramitha, Oblivion, and Terminus. It was a taboo that instilled extreme fear in the gods of the world. During the boundless years of the past, there were too many rumors about samsara, but how many had actually seen samsara? Practically none could be found. Sure, you and the others hadn't seen it as well. However, at this moment, they were sure that it was the energy of samsara. Because the unexpected change that was happening to Arui right now was exactly the effect of samsara. Countless years had passed while innumerable rumors had been passed down through the generations. But at this moment, samsara had finally appeared in the world. The shock caused by all of this caused Shiryu and the others to be dazed, and their minds were blank. Samsara. Samsara. So it actually exists. Outside the shaman spirit battle domain and in the sky above the grand abyss of catastrophe, the sky had suddenly shattered into pieces and fell to the ground. Moreover, the grand Tao collapsed while order ceased to exist. The stars and ocean of fire that were originally descending from the sky seemed to have been grabbed by an invisible hand, and they rumbled as they shattered into pieces before transforming into nothingness at this moment. In practically a short moment, this place had fallen into chaos. Bang! At this moment, the scenes of the passage of time and the rise and fall of all things were occurring in every single area of the forgotten grounds of chaos. As these scenes extended towards the surroundings, everything became blurry and warped. Swish! At this moment, the enormous door of the last days, which was covered in bones in the depths of the grand abyss of catastrophe, had started to tremble violently. The bones seemed to have lost all their energy, and they fell successively from the door of the last days and trickled down to the ground. In the end, the true appearance of the door of the last days was revealed. Outside the forgotten grounds of chaos, in the boundless starry sky, the figure of the Dean of the Tao Institute, Lu Xinji, had suddenly shook as he meditated there, and then he swiftly opened his eyes. Universes circulated within his deep and boundless gaze, and then a terrifying glow arose within them. It seemed like he was able to see through the secrets of the universe. At practically the exact same instant that Lu Xinji had opened his eyes, the Tao Lord Kaya, Wu Shuachan, Tao Lord Xueling, Tao Lord Su Tuo, and Tao Lord Xianming had suddenly opened their eyes. They'd been meditating here for many years, and they were just waiting for 10 years to be up before they would join forces to open that passageway to the forgotten grounds of chaos once more and bring their disciples back. But at this moment, the 10 years weren't up yet. However, they'd simultaneously noticed something instead, and they'd awakened from their meditation. This was clearly not ordinary at all. An unexpected and shocking change has occurred. What exactly is it? My heart is ill at ease. How many years has it been? I thought I wouldn't encounter such a situation anymore. Is it fortune? Or misfortune? Wuxia and the others fell silent while they deduced in their hearts with all their power. However, they noticed to their surprise that their deductions were completely blurry and chaotic. They were utterly unable to find any clues. This caused their expressions to grow even more serious, and it had even become slightly solemn, because it was very rare for existences like them to be unable to see through any secrets. Tao Lord Kaya guessed. Could it be that the true secrets of the ultimate path towards the Tao have appeared? The eyelids of the others twitched slightly. If it's true, then it isn't anything bad. There's no need to guess blindly. This unexpected event has great implications. I'm afraid that a great change is about to occur in the ancient god domain from now onward. Lu Xinji stood up, and then he stared at the extremely chaotic area of space in the distance before he sighed with emotion. He seemed to have noticed something yet didn't dare confirm it, and his voice carried a secretive tone. Lu Xinji was an existence who rivaled the master of Oracle Mountain, the master of Nuostao Palace, the master of the Sovereign Sect, and the dean of the Divine Institute. Since even he'd spoken in such a manner, it caused Wu Shuichan and the others to fall silent while they each had their own thoughts. Perhaps we'll be able to find out the truth once those little children return. Lu Xinji sat down cross-legged and entered into a meditative state after he'd finished speaking these words. Wu Shuichan and the others exchanged glances while their hearts were unable to calm down for a long time. All of them were guessing what Lu Xinji's words from before meant. This unexpected event has great implications? What exactly is that unexpected event? At this moment, an unexpected event had similarly occurred far away in the ancient god domain on Godrank Mountain. The Godrank chart that was eternally enveloped by chaos in the sky had suddenly started emanating world-shaking rumbling as it appeared above the world, and it emanated boundless and dazzling radiance. It seemed like it had been infuriated by some sort of force, and the radiance didn't disperse for a long time. This scene instantly alarmed those might figures who were sitting cross-legged around the god attainment altar. It caused them to awaken successively from their meditation before swiftly shooting their gazes towards the god rank chart. In the end, a single thought had appeared simultaneously in the minds of these mighty figures. A great change is arriving. The shaman spirit battle domain. Samsara flowed and revealed all sorts of phenomena that shocked everyone. At this moment, Arui had already transformed into a young child that stood on the spot with a dazed expression while his cultivation had been completely lost. He seemed to be so innocent, ignorant, and dazed at this moment, yet Shuryu and the others felt no pity for him. Conversely, they had a feeling of delight from being able to get revenge instead. Of course, Shuryu and the others were most shocked by the ability that she revealed right now, and it allowed them to finally understand how terrifying Samsara was. In the blink of an eye, it had soundlessly seized away the memories, experiences, and strength possessed by a terrifying existence who was comparable to a 9th-star region lord, and it had transformed that existence into a helpless young child. How could any cultivator be willing to be reduced to such a state? The glory, status, strength, experience, path towards the Tao. Everything had transformed into nothingness. This was simply more painful than death. Most astounding to Shuryu and the others was that the energy of Samsara was still ceaselessly entering Arui, and it was changing everything about him without end. In the end, Arui actually transformed into a droplet of blood. It was a droplet of dark golden blood that was suffused with the aura of a holy shaman. This was extremely shocking. Who would have imagined that such a terrifying existence like Arui would actually have been formed from a drop of blood? Most importantly, Who did this drop of dark golden blood belong to? Shiryu and the others were horrified. They suddenly recalled that Jianan had previously said that Erui was from a descendant of the one and only overlord of the last era, the Holy King. So, his status was extremely lofty and respected. So, didn't this mean that the drop of dark golden blood belonged to that mysterious and unfathomable Holy King? When they thought up to here, the hearts of Shiryu and the others couldn't help but turn cold. A single drop of blood was actually able to form a terrifying existence comparable to a 9th-star region lord. So exactly how terrifying is this Holy King's strength? Moreover, since Erui was able to survive the obliteration of the last era, doesn't that mean that it's very likely for that Holy King to be alive? Perhaps he's hiding right here in the forgotten grounds of chaos? The more carefully they thought about it, the more surprised and anxious they were in their hearts, and it had indirectly weakened the shock they felt towards the energy of samsara. Hiss! Hiss! Right at this moment, the drop of dark gold blood had vanished as well. It transformed into nothingness and vanished completely from the world. In other words, at this moment, Erui who was being affected by the energy of samsara had completely perished, and not a trace of him remained. When they saw this, Shiryu and the others instantly noticed that the energy of samsara which suffused this expanse of the heavens and the earth was vanishing swiftly. Moreover, they'd recovered their freedom at this moment, and they weren't frozen on the spot like puppets anymore. This allowed them to heave long sighs of relief, and then they stopped thinking about everything as they simultaneously gazed towards Xianxia who stood on the shaman spirit sacrificial altar. At this moment it was just like before. Xianxia was still bathed in blood while his body was on the verge of shattering. Moreover, his face was covered in blood, and only his eyes had become even more cold and indifferent. He held the condemn evil brush in one hand and the netherworld register in the other, and he seemed like he was standing amidst the annals of time as he watched time pass and all things experience the cycle of life and death. At this moment, Shiryu and the others had the incomprehensible feeling that he was unfamiliar. It was like the Xianxia who stood before them was a different Xianxia than the Xianxia they knew, and it made it difficult for them to treat him as they'd done in the past. Moreover, a complicated feeling of fear and reverence had arisen in their hearts. Was Xianxia who'd taken control of samsara the same Xianxia from before? Bang! Before Shiryu and the others could recover from their shock, an explosion resounded. All the heavily injured ancient shamans who resided at the other side of the sacrificial altar had actually perished at this moment, and they transformed into nothingness. What? Shiryu and the others were astounded. I left a trace of the energy of Terminus within them when I captured them just now. Meanwhile, Xianxia spoke abruptly while residing on the sacrificial altar. His voice didn't carry any emotion, and it was the first time he'd spoken after he killed Erui. The words he spoke provided a good explanation of the reason why the ancient shamans had suddenly perished, and besides feeling dazed by this, Shiryu and the others felt admiration towards how skillfully Xianxia had handled the matter. It turned out that he'd planned everything since the beginning, and he hadn't intended to let them go at all. At the same time, hearing Xianxia speak allowed Shiryu and the others to heave sighs of relief for no reason. It was like they'd found that old Xianxia who they were familiar with. They didn't want Xianxia to become a complete stranger to them because of samsara. Bang! In next to no time, the entire shaman spirit battle domain shook, and then it shattered inch by inch like glass before transforming into powder. In the blink of an eye, Xianxia and the others had appeared once more in the depths of the grand abyss of catastrophe. This indirectly proved what Erui had said before. The two parties to the battle within the battle domain could only escape it after life and death was decided. They were dead. All those ancient shamans had been annihilated. They had originally been planning for a long time and set up flawless plans of action. Moreover, they stopped at nothing to draw Xianxia and the others into the grand abyss of catastrophe, and it was naturally for the sake of seizing their destiny and opening the door of the last days so that they could bring calamity to the world and obliterate the current era. However, they'd perished before they could even carry this plan out to its end. They were defeated at Xianxia's hand and defeated by the energy of samsara. Shiryu and the others were even certain that if Xianxia wasn't here with them, then Erui's group would have definitely been able to capture all of them without any difficulty. It was even to the extent that if Xianxia hadn't utilized the energy of samsara at the critical moment, then they would be annihilated as well. After all, Arui was truly too strong. His strength was comparable to a 9th-star region lord, and merely Arui alone was sufficient to sweep through all of them. So, to be precise, the reason they were able to survive was entirely because of Xianxia's energy of samsara. At this moment, when they returned to the grand abyss of catastrophe once more, Shiryu and the others recalled the dangers they'd experienced all along the way, and they actually became dazed and felt as if ages had passed. But in next to no time, their gazes had been drawn over by the enormous door of the last days in the distance. The bones that piled up on the surface of the door of the last days had actually fallen to the ground while they were trapped with the battle domain, and they had formed the ocean of bones once more. On the other hand, the door of the last days had revealed its true appearance for the first time. Its pitch-black surface seemed as if it was made from chaotic rock that was only found during the ancient times, and it was suffused with a desolate, ancient, and icy cold aura. Strands of gray bolts of lightning were flowing, flickering, and surging incessantly on the surface of the door, and they emanated a terrifying aura that caused a chill to run down one's spine. Last Day's Tribulation Lightning. Shiryu and the others didn't even have to guess before this name appeared in their minds. The dense gray-colored bolts of lightning were surprisingly formed from the energy of last days. When they looked at it even more carefully, everything they saw was blurry, causing them to be unable to discern anything. Because the gray bolts of lightning were flickering incessantly and enveloped the door of the last days, and they caused others to be unable to avoid feeling piercing pain in their eyes when they looked over. Shiryu couldn't help but sigh with emotion. Everything those damnable heretics did was for the sake of opening this door of the last days and releasing the calamity behind it so that calamity would descend to the world. Unfortunately, they're unable to accomplish their objective anymore. Step. Right at this moment, Shiryu suddenly noticed that Xianxia had actually started striding towards the door of the last days. Xianxia's feet emanated muffled taps as he strode through space, and the sight of this caused Shiryu to be instantly horrified. "What's that fellow doing?" Shiryu's expression changed slightly. He opened his mouth with the intention of calling out to Xianxia, but he was stopped by Jianan, who'd already noticed what Xianxia was doing. "Don't stop him." At this moment, Jianan's expression was slightly strange. His gaze was like a bolt of lightning as he stared at Xianxia, and he actually seemed as if he was waiting for something. Why? What if that fellow, Xianxia, opens the door of the last days? Wouldn't that be the end of everything? Shiryu frowned. He felt anxious as a bad feeling had appeared in his heart. Since Xianxia had utilized the energy of samsara, Shiryu noticed that Xianxia seemed to have become a completely different person. Now, when he saw Xianxia approaching the door of the last days without saying anything, it made him realize an extremely serious problem. Earlier, Arui had said that throughout the world, only Xianxia alone was able to open the door of the last days. Because Xianxia possessed the river diagram and was the 9th comprehender of the river diagram during this era. Moreover, Xianxia was worthy of the title of Savior. During the last 8 eras, it was exactly because of figures like Xianxia who'd opened the door of the last days over and over again that those 8 previous eras had been obliterated. Moreover, all of this was exactly why Arui and the others had exercised forbearance until now, and it was also the reason why they'd resolutely chosen to act now. Arui wanted to seize Xianxia's destiny. He wanted to replace Xianxia as the savior of this era and open the door of the last days. It was exactly based on such understanding that Shiryu had such a huge reaction when he saw Xianxia moving step by step towards the door of the last days. Shiryu suspected that Xianxia's consciousness had been completely suppressed, and his body was being controlled by a strange force that intended to open the door of the last days. Don't forget the rumors about the door of the last days. Besides being able to bring calamity to the world, it's very likely that the true secrets of the ultimate path towards the Tao are hidden within it. Shiryu couldn't help but be stunned when Jianan spoke these words. Even Qin Xinhui, who stood by Shiryu's side, seemed as if she'd woken up from a dream, and she recalled the rumors. So, Xianxia intends to search for the true secrets of the ultimate path towards the Tao? Shiryu was still full of worry. But in this way, It's equivalent to indirectly triggering the calamity of the last days. What, what, what should we do? When he spoke up to hear, he couldn't help but turn to look at Jianan. Are you sure that he'll really be fine? Jianan pondered deeply for a long time before he said, Do you know which era we're at? The 9th. Sure you didn't give it any thought before he'd spoken these words. Earlier he wasn't aware of this. But after he heard Arui just now, he understood that 8 eras of this world had been obliterated before this current era. Jianan continued, Then do you know what number Chun-Shi is in the line of comprehenders of the river diagram during this era? Shuri still didn't give it any thought before he answered. The 9th. 9 is the end of the number. Jianan had lightly spat out these few words, yet the meaning behind his words seemed very incomprehensible. 9 is the end of the number? Shuryu was stunned, and then he almost cursed aloud. What sort of lousy reason is that? However, when Shuryu noticed Jianan's solemn expression and that Jianan didn't seem like he was joking, Shuryu had forcefully restrained himself in the end, and he didn't continue on this topic. Then what should we do? Should we follow Chun-Shi in or leave right now? Asked Qin Xinhui. This was a problem indeed. Presently, Arui's group had been annihilated. Logically speaking, it was exactly the best opportunity for them to escape from the grand abyss of catastrophe. However, at this moment, everything was thrown into chaos by Chun-Shi's sudden actions, and it caused them to be in a dilemma. It's very simple. We wait. As he spoke, Jianan sat cross-legged on the ground, and he seemed that he intended to wait here for a long period of time. Wait! Shuryu and Qin Xinhui exchanged glances, and both of them frowned. Presently, even if Arui's group has been annihilated, it's utterly impossible for us to leave the grand abyss of catastrophe while relying solely on our own strength. In next to no time, Jianan explained. Moreover, we can't approach the door of the last days as well. The energy within it isn't something that we can resist at all. At this moment, Shuryu and Qin Xinhui had finally come to an understanding. Just as Jianan said, they could only choose to wait right now. So, even if Shuryu was filled with questions right now, he could only put them aside for now, and he started waiting on the spot like Jianan was. During this entire process, Shuryu had checked on Kong Yuran and the others' conditions, and he finally relaxed quite a bit when he noticed that they were slowly recovering from their injuries. Earlier, while they were in the Shaman Spirit Battle domain, Kong Yuran, Yechen, Yu Jihui, and Zhao Qingyao had been crushed and captured successively, and their fates had been unknown. This caused Shuryu and the others to really break out in cold sweat. Now, not only had all of them escaped the predicament, Kong Yuran and the others had started to recover slowly. Such an outcome could be considered to be really not bad. The only source of worries for Shuryu right now was Chun-Shi, who resided in the distance. What exactly does he intend to do by approaching the door of the last days? Step, step. Chun-Shi's footsteps were neither fast nor slow as he strode through space. His expression remained completely tranquil, and not a trace of emotion could be discerned from him. In next to no time, he'd arrived before the door of the last days. When compared to the enormous door that towered into the sky, he seemed extremely tiny like an ant. Rumble! The gray last days tribulation lightning transformed into dense bolts of lightning that flowed incessantly on the surface of the door, and they emanated an extremely terrifying aura. Chun-Shi stood there while seeming to have utterly not noticed the danger before him. He just stared fixedly at the door, and no one knew what he was actually thinking. At this moment, Chun-Shi was really acting unusually. He was clearly bathed in blood while his body was practically on the verge of shattering into pieces, but it seemed to have not aroused his attention at all. His expression was completely tranquil while his bloodied face maintained an expression that was cold and indifferent to the extreme. Swish! Suddenly, the condemn evil brush appeared in Chun-Shi's hand, and then he exerted force with his palm, causing the tip of the brush to seem like a blade that could pierce through the sky as it stabbed deep into the dense expanse of last days tribulation lightning. At this instant, the hearts of Shuryu and the others who noticed this scene couldn't help but constrict. All of them were worried that Chun-Shi would suffer calamity. After all, it was the last days tribulation lightning, so how could it be ordinary? However, to their surprise, The dense gray arcs of last day's tribulation lightning were actually easily broken through. It was as easy as tearing up a piece of cloth, and it was unable to harm Xianxia at all. Swish! Swish! Xianxia continued. The condemn evil brush in his hand was like a sharp blade that was breaking through the obstacles before him, and it tore apart the last day's tribulation lightning that covered the door of the last days and caused them to disperse incessantly. In the end, an area of around 10 square meters was exposed on the surface of the door. What's that? The figures of Yu and the others shook. Surprisingly, a row of extremely strange markings of the Tao was branded in that area. Those markings of the Tao seemed as if they were created by nature, and they floated into appearance on the surface of the door. Moreover, they revealed a gray and hazy glow that made it seem as if they were formed from chaotic qi. Moreover, they emanated an indescribably supreme aura. It was a terrifying pressure. It was like the supreme laws that suppressed the universe yet also seemed like the original marks at the quintessence of chaos. It revealed an indescribably terrifying force. At the instant that they laid eyes upon this row of strange markings of the Tao, Yu and the others felt like they'd witnessed the true appearance of the heaven Tao. Their Tao hearts couldn't help but shudder, while a strand of reverence that couldn't be restrained appeared in their hearts. They simply wished for nothing more than to kneel down and worship it. It was too terrifying. After all, Yu and the others were region lords now. They could be considered as peak figures throughout the entire ancient god domain. They were overlords of a region. Yet now, merely laying eyes upon that row of strange markings of the Tao had actually caused them to be unable to avoid feeling reverent, and they were powerless to control their own Tao hearts. How shocking was that? All forces that were obtained to attack me will definitely be obliterated. All who going against my will as they cultivate will be judged. I'm supreme, infinite, and boundless. So, I exist everywhere. At this instant, Jianan's clothes fluttered while shocking light erupted from his eyes, and he stared fixedly at the strange markings of the Tao while he spoke. Every single word he spoke seemed to carry some sort of force that shook the heart and threw the world into disorder. Yu and the others felt like they'd been struck by lightning. Their minds went blank while their thoughts were devoured by tempestuous waves. That's the meaning contained within that row of strange markings of the Tao? Who exactly left it behind? All forces that were obtained to attack me will definitely be obliterated. All who going against my will as they cultivate will definitely be judged. How arrogant! Who dared to call himself supreme, boundless, and infinite? Who dared to say that he existed everywhere? This is simply like comparing himself to the heaven Tao. It was unimaginable to them. These words that were like the quintessence of the Tao had been spoken by Jianan, and they carried a force that shook the soul. It caused Yu and the others to be dumbstruck on the spot, and they were unable to return to their senses for a long time. Perhaps anyone who arrived here and heard those words would be unable to maintain their calm and composure. Even Jianan himself had fallen into a form of extreme horror. He noticed to his shock that he didn't recognize those strange markings of the Tao at all. However, it just so happened that it was he who spoke those words, and it was even to the extent that he was unable to stop himself from saying it. This was extremely horrifying. Right amidst this extremely shocking and deathly silent atmosphere, no one had noticed that Xianxia had utilized the condemn evil brush to instantly eliminate the strange markings of the Tao. The place where it was had become blank, and not a trace of it could be found anymore. After that, Xianxia exerted force with his wrist to make the tip of the brush move about, and he actually started writing a row of extremely strange markings of the Tao as well. Moreover, they seemed as if they were created by nature. Bang! Right when the row of strange markings of the Tao was formed, they suddenly started to surge about before they swiftly condensed into a vortex that appeared at the blank area. After that, an irresistible suction force was released from within the vortex. In an instant, it actually sucked Xianxia's entire body into the vortex, and then the vortex vanished completely from the door of the last days. It was exactly this instant that Yu and the others recovered from the incomprehensible shocked state from before, and they couldn't find a trace of Xianxia when they gazed once more at the door of the last days. It was even to the extent that the blank area had recovered to its original state, and it was enveloped by gray arcs of last day's tribulation lightning. Sure, you spoke while in a daze. What happened just now? I clearly remember that Chun Shi opened up a blank area on the door of the last days. Why has it suddenly vanished? Qin Xinhui was slightly anxious and bewildered. He has gone in. Jianan remained silent for a long time before he took a deep breath and lightly spat out a few words. Moreover, his voice carried a rare trace of a dazed tone. Sure, you frowned as he pondered bitterly. But I clearly remember seeing a row of mysterious and strange markings of the Tao. But why am I unable to recall it at all? Right, I saw it as well. But, I've forgotten the meaning of those markings of the Tao. This? Qin Xinhui was even more anxious and bewildered, and she even stuttered slightly because of this. Both of you can't remember it as well? Jiana sighed, and then he gazed at the door of the last days as he muttered. Our memories have probably been soundlessly wiped away. Yes, even he had forgotten it. It seemed as if he'd never spoken those words just now. However, Jianan was clearly aware that it wasn't an illusion, and it was instead because a mysterious force had wiped away all the memories in his mind that were related to it. Why has this happened? At this moment, he fell into an indescribably dazed and shocked state. All of this seemed like a mystery that couldn't be unraveled, and it caused him to feel extremely powerless. Perhaps it was a taboo, and it wasn't something we could pry into. In the end, it's because our strength is too inferior. Jianan recovered his calm and said in a light voice, There's no need for us to continue thinking about all of that. We can confirm that Chun Shi has already entered the door of the last days, and we can only do one thing now. Wait. Sure, Yu and Qin Xinhui fell silent while their emotions were complicated to the extreme. But no matter what, they could only do as Jianan said and wait silently. They could only wait for Chun Shi to return from within the door of the last days. However, never had they imagined that there would actually be no sign of Chun Shi after an entire year had passed. During this year of time, the grand abyss of catastrophe was deathly silent, and no further unexpected events had occurred. Even the towering door of the last days stood there silently and didn't change at all. In the second year, Kong Yuran, Yechen, Yu Jihui, and Zhao Qingyao had recovered and awoken. However, Chun Shi still hadn't returned. On the third year, Shi Yu and the others were unable to maintain their silence any longer, because this year was the 10th year since they entered the forgotten grounds of chaos. According to the agreement between the 5 extremes of the Imperial region, the 5 extremes of the Imperial region would once again establish the passageway that led to the forgotten grounds of chaos from the outside world so that they could return. But now there was still no news about Chun Shi. Why is it like this? Could it be that Chun Shi has suffered some sort of unforeseen mishap in the door of the last days? A wisp of worry was coiled around all of their hearts. Bang! After a few more months passed, an extremely enormous rift was torn open in the forgotten grounds of chaos. After that, a dazzling and brilliant passageway was established through that rift and extended down incessantly. In the end, the passageway actually seemed as if it possessed intelligence and arrived in the sky above the grand abyss of catastrophe. The passageway was like a bridge of light that linked the outside world to the forgotten grounds of chaos, and it was suffused with an illusory and misty glow as it stretched across the sky above the grand abyss of catastrophe. There was no doubt that this was the passageway that was jointly created by the 5 extremes of the Imperial region. Disciples of the various sects, quickly return right now. The dignified voice of the Tao Institute's dean, Lu Xinji, emerged from within the passageway, and it surged through the world and swept into the grand abyss of catastrophe. Swoosh! At the bottom of the grand abyss of catastrophe, Kong Yuran, Yechen, Jianan, who resided far away from the enormous door of the last days, had swiftly raised their heads, and then a wisp of excitement appeared on their faces. We can finally return? But right after that, some hesitance appeared on their faces. Since Chun Shi entered the door of the last days, an entire 3 years had passed now, and there was still no news about him until now. His fate was unknown. So, how could Kong Yuran and the others disregard Chen Shi and leave at such a time? Yu took a deep breath before he stated with a firm expression. If all of you are leaving, then leave now. I'll wait here for Xianxia. He'd been through situations of life and death with Xianxia, and they were good friends since the time they were in the 3 dimensions. So, he would naturally not leave by himself at such a time. If it wasn't for Xianxia, then I would have probably suffered calamity and died a long time ago. I don't intend to leave for now as well. Unexpectedly, Zhao Qingyao was the first to make her stand clear after Yu. This event has great implications. Life and death aren't important to me any longer. All I seek is to be able to watch all of this come to a complete end. Jianan spoke with a tranquil expression. Obviously, he refused to leave right now as well. In an instant, the others started looking at each other. All of them were clearly aware that Yu, Zhao Qingyao, and Jiana weren't playing around, and they absolutely hadn't made such a decision because of a temporary desire to display their loyalty. Perhaps, the reason they'd acted in this way was because the person who entered the door of the last days was none other than Xianxia. Merely this name alone was sufficient to make them announce their stand towards the situation without the slightest hesitation. I'm staying back, said Yu Jihui. Count me in, said Qin Xinhui. Yechen stated. The only thing we can do right now is wait. If even outright to wait is taken away, then we would be eternally haunted by our regrets even if we were able to return safely. In an instant, the others made their decisions as well. Indeed, the passageway to return to the ancient god domain had appeared, and it would undoubtedly be a blessing to them if they were able to return from the extremely dangerous forgotten grounds of chaos. However, when compared to all of this, Xianxia's safety was undoubtedly more important to all of them, because they were very clearly aware that it was absolutely impossible for them to have survived the dangers that they'd faced this time without Xianxia's help. This was a form of acknowledgement. Before they entered the forgotten grounds of chaos, Xianxia absolutely didn't possess such great charm that could even make geniuses like Kong Yuran and the others feel convinced of his superiority. However, it was different now. Everything they'd experienced in the forgotten grounds of chaos had allowed Xianxia to establish a form of an irreplaceable prestige and influence in their hearts. It was exactly their experiences of going through thick and thin together that made Kong Yuran and the others stay behind willingly and without the slightest complaint. Suddenly, Kong Yuran stood up and spoke slowly. According to the agreement from before, the passageway can be maintained for 3 years of time. So, instead of just waiting here, why don't we take some active action instead? Let me see if I can contact those seniors who are waiting outside the forgotten grounds of chaos. If I'm able to obtain their guidance, then perhaps we'll be able to hasten Xianxia's return. The others nodded successively. Swoosh! In the next moment, Kong Yuran vanished on the spot. 3 years ago, when Xianxia entered the door of the last days, the grand abyss of catastrophe had soundlessly undergone a transformation. The most obvious change was that the Tao-restrained tribulation energy that filled the entire abyss had started to gradually vanish. In the end, all the dangers within the abyss had vanished without a trace. This change had occurred after Xianxia entered the door of the last days, but no one knew exactly why such change had occurred. However, all of this wasn't important. The important thing was that the changes in the abyss was sufficient for them to leave safely, and they weren't trapped here anymore. But none of them had left throughout these 3 years of time. Even if Kong Yuran had charged out of the abyss right now, she didn't have any intention to leave. The passageway was like a divine ray of light that stretched across the sky above the abyss, and it seemed extraordinarily striking amidst the gray and hazy world here. Kong Yuran's gaze had been immediately attracted by the passageway upon leaving the abyss. But in next to no time, she calmed her emotions and revealed a serious expression. Junior is Kong Yuran from Nuwas Dao Palace. Greetings, seniors. Kong Yuran bowed while she sent her consciousness through the passageway with the intent of getting in contact with those great figures outside the forgotten grounds of chaos. There was no reaction from within the passageway at all, and it was deathly silent. Right when Kong Yuran was slightly disappointed, Lu Xinji's voice had suddenly resounded from within the passageway. Has some sort of mishap occurred? Kong Yuran's heart shook. She'd never imagined that Lu Xinji would have actually guessed what happened from just a few words she'd spoken. However, when she thought about it carefully, She felt that it was very understandable. Logically speaking, they probably wouldn't hesitate at all upon noticing the passageway that led back to the ancient god domain, and they would charge into it at the first possible moment. How could they have possibly tried to contact the outside world like Kong Yuran had? Perhaps Lu Xinji had perceived this, and that was the reason why he'd instantly discerned the situation Kong Yuran and the others were in. After she heard Lu Xinji's voice, Kong Yuran didn't give it any further thought. She organized the thoughts in her mind before she slowly described everything that had occurred in the grand abyss of catastrophe. After 10 minutes had passed, Kong Yuran returned to Shiryu and the others, and her face carried a strange expression that was impossible to eliminate. Moreover, she'd remained silent throughout this time. Shiryu, Yechen, Jianan, and the others had quickly noticed this. Shiryu couldn't refrain from asking, "Something unexpected happened?" Senior Lu Xinji said. Kong Yuran hesitated for a moment before she said, "If Chunxi's alive, then a door is unable to trap him. If he has suffered calamity and perished, then it would be useless even if we wait for an eternity." She paused for a moment, took a deep breath, and continued. "Most importantly, if we resolutely choose to continue waiting here after 3 years from now has passed, then we'll only face a single outcome." "What?" The hearts of everyone had jerked. Kong Yuran lightly spat out a single word. "Death." In an instant, all of them were stunned, and they fell silent. "Chun-Shi won't die," said Jianan in a firm tone. In the opinion of the others, there was clearly no need to say that because they similarly firmly believed that Chun-Shi would be fine. However, even if Chun-Shi didn't die, it didn't mean that he could return from the door within 3 years of time. This was the crux of the matter. "Then what should we do? I'll be eternally unable to eat and sleep in peace if I'm unable to see Chun-Shi return safely," said Shiryu with a frown on his face. "We can choose to wait for 3 years, and we must leave if Chun-Shi is still unable to return by then." Even though Kong Yuran wasn't willing to mention this topic, she was very clearly aware that they had to decide right now. According to Senior Lu Xinji, the entire Forgotten Grounds of Chaos will experience great calamity in 3 years from now. At that time, we'll definitely be buried here if we haven't left by then. When she spoke up to hear, Kong Yuran glanced at the others and said, "What do all of you think?" The others fell silent once more. In the end, all of them accepted Kong Yuran's suggestion, and they really hoped that Chun-Shi would be able to return within these 3 years of time. Time flower by soundlessly. 3 years late, in the sky above the grand abyss of catastrophe. Not only did Kong Yuran and the others feel zero excitement as they gazed at the passageway that pierced through space, they felt boundless disappointment instead. Up until now, Chun-Shi had still not returned. "We can't wait anymore. We should leave." Kong Yuran spoke with slight difficulty. She knew that these words seemed slightly cruel at this moment, but she had no choice but to speak them. "Yes, let's go. I'll be heading to Oracle Mountain to continue waiting after we return to the ancient god domain." Shiryu stared blankly as he said, "I won't leave until he returns." His voice was heavy and bleak yet extremely firm. When they heard this, the emotions of the others rose and fell, and they were unable to calm down. Bang! The passageway suddenly shook violently and started to become unstable. It seemed as if it would collapse and be destroyed at any moment. "Let's go. Quickly." Kong Yuran's expression immediately turned solemn when she saw this. The others stopped hesitating as well, and they followed Kong Yuran as they charged into the passageway and vanished. After a short moment, a practically ethereal blood-red shadow suddenly appeared in the sky above the grand abyss of catastrophe. There was practically not a trace of an aura throughout his body, and it caused others to be utterly unable to notice his existence. However, as he stood there casually, he emanated an indescribably terrifying might, and he seemed like he was the overlord of the Forgotten Grounds of Chaos. "Those little bastards have finally left," that blood-red shadow muttered with an aged and indifferent voice that carried a tone of boundless wisdom through experience. It was like a vast howl of the wind that came from the last era. Bang! That voice hadn't finished resounding through the air when the passageway suddenly started to collapse inch by inch, and it emanated terrifying explosions and illuminated this gray and hazy world. Suddenly, a huge palm that was covered in clear and brilliant radiance stretched out from within the collapsing passageway, and it instantly transformed into a state where it blotted out the sky before grabbing forcefully at the blood-red shadow who was seemingly ethereal. Bang! At this instant, the world was blasted into pieces and all things were obliterated beneath the might of that palm. It seemed to be terrifying to the extreme. If one looked carefully, one would notice that the striations on that palm were formed from the Grand Tao. They contained supreme profundities of the Tao, and they seemed to embrace all things and possessed extraordinarily vast might. The blood-red shadow seemed to be surprised and bewildered, and then he flicked his sleeve before swiftly charging into the grand abyss of catastrophe and vanishing. That palm that blotted out the sky was actually unable to obstruct him. Humph! A cold grunt sounded out from within the passageway, and then it vanished as the passageway was obliterated. Moreover, the palm that blotted out the sky had vanished along with the passageway as well. The blood-red shadow appeared at the grand abyss of catastrophe's bottom. His hands were kept behind his back as he gazed at the enormous door of the last days that towered in the distance, and he felt into a long period of deep thought. Samsara has actually appeared for real. Looks like this era is this king's final chance to step foot onto the end of the ultimate path. In this way, I can't be said to have failed on the verge of success. All of this is a new opportunity as well. Unfortunately, that child, Arui. Now, I can only wait for the calamity of the last days to descend. The blood-red shadow muttered and sighed with emotion. In the next moment, his figure swiftly vanished on the spot. On this day, a great calamity struck the forgotten grounds of chaos. The sky collapsed, the stars exploded into pieces, and all things fell into seemingly endless chaos. A terrifying aura of destruction started to rage like a storm throughout the forgotten grounds of chaos, and it seemed like the world here had transformed into purgatory itself. No one dared to step foot here anymore. Outside the forgotten grounds of chaos. A wave of fluctuation arose in the starry sky, and then a door appeared there. After that, Kong Yuran, Shi Yu, Qin Xinhui, Yechen Yu Jihui, Jianan, and Zhao Qingyao emerged successively. All of you are back. Dao Lord Xueling from Nuwas Dao Palace was already waiting there, and she welcomed Kong Yuran, Shi Yu, and Qin Xinhui back. At practically the exact same moment, Dao Lord Kai welcomed Yu Jihui and Yechen back. Only Oracle Mountain's Grand Lord, Wu Shuachan, the Sovereign Sect's Divine Sovereign Priest, Su Tuo, and the Divine Institute's Dao Lord Xian Ming were stunned on the spot, because the disciples from their respective sects weren't amongst the disciples who had returned. What's going on? Dao Lord Su Tuo's expression instantly turned cold, and he emanated an oppressive aura. He turned to gaze at Jianan and Zhao Qingyao. Jianan's expression was tranquil and composed, and he remained silent. Zhao Qingyao hesitated for a moment, and she spoke in the end. Besides Chun Shi, all the others have probably suffered calamity. What? Dao Lord Su Tuo and Dao Lord Xian Ming's eyes had narrowed simultaneously, and they emanated an extremely terrifying aura. Only the Grand Lord Wu Shuachan was stunned, and then he seemed to have thought of something. The passageway has shattered. It's almost impossible for them to return even if they're still alive. Meanwhile, a sigh resounded as the thin figure of the Dean of the Tao Institute, Lu Xinji, appeared here. He just stood there casually. Yet he completely dispersed the terrifying auras emanated by Su Tuo and Xian Ming. That's impossible. Su Tuo's muddy eyes were filled with a shocking glow, and he seemed like an infuriated, ferocious beast while his voice was filled with boundless rage. He was unable to accept such an outcome. A total of 5 disciples from the Sovereign Sect had entered the forgotten grounds of chaos this time, and it was even a leading figure like Lang Xinghuan who'd led the group there. So, how could they have possibly been annihilated? It wasn't just Su Tuo, even Xian Ming's expression had turned gloomy when he found out, and the figures of Donghuang Inxian, Zhu Qianyu, Gongsun Mu, and the others had appeared in his mind. At this moment, he felt shocked, furious, and filled with disbelief. Wu Shuachan spoke in a warm voice as he asked Zhao Qingyao, "What exactly happened?" Zhao Qingyao thought for a moment, and then she shook her head and said, I don't know about the death of the others. All I know is that Wang Zhong's true identity was an expert of the ancient shamans from the last era. After that, she described everything related to Wang Zhong, and it was even to the extent that she told them about all the dangers they faced in the grand abyss of catastrophe. Of course, Zhao Qingyao hadn't mentioned anything about the energy of samsara that Xianxia possessed. The last era, the ancient shamans, a plot that had been in motion for a long time. Wuxiachan's expression couldn't help but become serious when he heard this, and his eyes were filled with an expression of deep thought. Even the infuriated Su Tuo and Xianming had frowned while their expressions changed slightly, and they fell into silence. They as well had never imagined that such numerous dangers would actually exist in the forgotten grounds of chaos, and it would even be connected to the ancient shamans of the last era. This was slightly unusual. After all, the reason they joined force to send the disciples of the sects into the forgotten grounds of chaos was actually very simple, and they merely wanted to allow their disciples to establish a new region, grasp region energy, and step foot into the ranks of region lords. Their other objection was to search for the mysterious area in the forgotten grounds of chaos and see if the true secrets of the ultimate path towards the Tao really existed there. But none of them had imagined that the development of the situation would completely exceed their imagination. Wait, something's not right. Suddenly, Su Tuo stared coldly at Zhao Qingyao and said, According to what you said, that Erui clearly possessed a strength that wasn't inferior to a 9th-star region lord. So why was he defeated by that kid, Xianxia? In the end? Zhao Qingyao's face froze. You're lying. Su Tuo didn't give Zhao Qingyao the time to respond at all, and he shouted loudly with a tone that was suffused with killing intent. It caused Zhao Qingyao's entire body to tremble while her pretty face turned ghastly pale. He was a Tao Lord, so how could Zhao Qingyao, who just stepped foot into the ranks of region lords, be able to endure his might? It was the river diagram. Jianan, who'd remained silent until now, had finally spoken, and he helped Zhao Qingyao deal with the invisible pressure she faced. Seniors should probably be aware that Xianxia possesses the river diagram. According to those heretics, the ancient shamans, the energy of the river diagram is capable of being a threat to them. The river diagram. Just these two words caused the Tao Lords in the surroundings to fall silent. This treasure was of mysterious origin, and it was unprecedentedly rare. It had even caused countless slaughters a very long time ago. However, since the ancient times until now, very few had been able to possess it, and this caused the river diagram to seem even more mysterious. So, when they heard from Jianan that Xianxia had utilized the might of the river diagram to deal with Erui, many of them started to become only partially doubtful. However, Jianan and Zhao Qingyao were clearly aware that it was actually not the river diagram that defeated Erui. Of course, they wouldn't expose this secret. Moreover, Kong Yuran, Yechun, and the others would keep the secret for Xianxia as well. After all, the energy of samsara was too much of a taboo. Once it was exposed, then even if Xianxia was able to return safely from the door of the last days, Xianxia would instantly become a thorn in the eyes of all the great figures within the universe. The consequences of this were absolutely unimaginable. Since it's like that, then where's Xianxia? Su Tuo was still slightly suspicious, and he glanced coldly at Jianan and Zhao Qingyao. If it wasn't out of consideration for Lu Xinji's presence here, he would truly wish for nothing more than to capture the two of them and question them. Xianxia entered the door of the last days. Kong Yuran, Shi Yu, and Qin Xinhui walked over successively under Tao Lord Xueling's lead. Obviously, Xueling had found out everything from them just now. The door of the last days. Wu Xuechan, Su Tuo, and Xianming were clearly aware of that door's origins. So, when he heard that Xianxia had actually entered it and hadn't returned until now, Wu Xuechan's brows couldn't help but knit together tightly, while a wisp of worry arose on his face. On the other hand, Xue Tuo and Xianming seemed as if they'd found balance in everything, and they heaved sighs of relief in their hearts. Now that the passageway has been destroyed, that kid will probably be unable to return forever, right? At this moment, when he saw that everyone had found out about what happened in the forgotten grounds of chaos, Lu Xinji finally said, Everyone, do all of you know who I say just now? Who? All of them simultaneously gazed at Lu Xinji, an existence that could be considered the one and only overlord of the last era, and he was called the King of Holy Shamans. Lu Xinji spoke word by word, and his voice was slightly low. I fought him with my will just now. Unfortunately, I was utterly unable to harm him at all. Based on this, I'm able to infer that Fellow's strength is probably not inferior to me at all. The hearts of everyone shook and couldn't calm down. The one and only overlord, the King of Holy Shamans? Such an extraordinary figure actually survived from the last era? Even Kong Yuran, Jianan, and the others were shocked and extremely horrified when they heard this, because they were very clearly aware that a Rui who possessed the strength of a 9th-star region lord merely possessed a single drop of that holy king's blood. Since such a great figure was still alive, then why hadn't he shown himself throughout these years while we waited for Xianxia? When they thought up to here, a wisp of coldness couldn't help but arise in the hearts of Kong Yuran and the others. They were clearly aware that if the Holy King had made an appearance at that time, then the Holy King would have been able to annihilate them in an instant. But he just so happened to have not shown himself. Why? Could it be that there's some sort of plot hidden behind all of this? It was unimaginable to them. A very long time ago, I'd once conducted a deduction with some friends, and we unanimously determined that a world-shocking and unexpected event would definitely occur in the ancient god domain. But I never expected that it would actually be triggered in the forgotten grounds of chaos. Lu Xinji's expression was slightly complicated as he sighed with emotion. Fortune, fate, karmic luck, the destiny of the Tao. Everything can't overcome the unexpected. From today onward, the ancient god domain will probably fall into a monstrous unexpected event. No one can determine if it's be a blessing or curse. After he finished speaking these words, a wisp of shock arose in all the Tao lords that were present here. Then may I ask Senior a question? If it were to occur in the ancient god domain, then where would it strike first? Xueling couldn't refrain from asking this question. Lu Xinji fell silent for a long time before he lightly spat out a few words. Godrank Mountain. The Divine Tao Protector Clans. It was just a few words, yet it seemed as if they possessed supreme magic that made the surroundings fall deathly silent for a very long time. After a long time, Lu Xinji shook his head and said, Destiny can't be defied. The unexpected is unfathomable. What's coming will come. He paused for a moment, and then he spoke with slightly flagging interest. Let's go. It's pointless to continue staying here. The others fell silent once more. No matter how puzzled, unwilling, perplexed, and bewildered they were, they could only do that. Leave. Yes, it was time for them to leave. All of this information related to the door of the last days, the ancient god domain, the holy king, the world-shocking unexpected event. All of them were too astounding, and they had to return to their respective sects to make plans and preparations in advance. As for Xianxia, Wuxia could only hope that his little junior brother would be able to return safely in the future. Because when facing such a sudden and unexpected event, even a Tao Lord like Wuxia could only choose to wait and was powerless to do anything else. Similarly, he couldn't stay here anymore, because Su Tuo and Xian Ming were eyeing him with hostility from the side. It was even to the extent that he suspected that it was very likely for the sovereign sect's master to take revenge on him if he stayed here any longer. After all, he'd called Tao Lord Mo Lin from the sovereign sect, and it had utterly infuriated the entire sovereign sect. In the end, Wu Shuichan's remained gloomy, and he carried a wisp of heaviness in his heart as he left. It wasn't just Wu Shuichan who was in such a state. The others were mostly the same. Perhaps their thoughts were different, but a wisp of an oppressive feeling that couldn't be eliminated remained in their hearts. For example, Su Tuo and Xian Ming were indignant and resentful. Moreover, they were filled with rage and suspicion towards the deaths of their disciples. For example, while they'd gotten out of the predicament they were in, they were unable to relax when they thought about how Chun-Chi's fate was still unknown even until now. After 13 years of time, the expedition to the forgotten grounds of chaos had finally come to an end, and only 7 out of the 30 disciples that participated had returned. The others were either dead or had gone missing. Gurgle. Bubbles surged out from within the muddle pool of water and emanated a strange gurgling sound. It sounded like a wild beast was snoring in its sleep. Xianxia's entire body was immersed within the pool. The skin all over his body was in pieces, and his bones were exposed to the water within the pool. His entire body seemed as if it was on the verge of shattering into pieces. Xianxia's eyes were closed tightly, while his vital energy was extremely weak. It was like he was being kept alive by a thread of vitality. He seemed like he was deeply unconscious to the point that even his consciousness was blurry. When he entered the door of the last days, Xianxia's body seemed as if it couldn't endure the burden that weighed down upon it anymore, and he collapsed into an unconscious state. He didn't know whether he was dead or alive. He didn't know where he was. He seemed as if he'd really died. The only difference was that his practically destroyed body still a trace of intermittent vital energy. 3 years passed by. 6 years passed by. 9 years passed. Time seemed to have become completely meaningless to Xianxia. He was unconscious. He didn't know the season or the time, nor was he aware of the situation around him or even himself. This was a strange state. It was like he'd lost everything and didn't know anything. Swish! After an unknown period of time, a strand of obscure energy seemed like a sharp that had sensed blood, and it surged silently into the muddy pool before carefully surging into Xianxia's extremely damaged body. This strand of obscure energy was extremely careful. It seemed to be exploring and observing something, and it stayed on Xianxia's ankle bone for a long time before it started to act. It was like a blood-sucking leech, and it was soundless and impossible to take preventions against. It moved along Xianxia's ankle and gradually arrived at his knee bone beneath his damaged flesh, and then it surged slowly towards Xianxia's stomach, chest. In the end, it stopped at Xianxia's neck without moving. It seemed to have noticed something and was afraid of something. This wait continued for over a year. It seemed to be extremely patient. A strand of extremely weak vital energy flashed through Xianxia's body that was practically on the verge of death, and then it vanished almost instantaneously. Swoosh! Right at this moment, that strand of obscure energy seemed to have grabbed the best opportunity, and it suddenly transformed into a bolt of lightning that passed through Xianxia's neck and swiftly arrived at Xianxia's sea of consciousness, which resided at the center of his forehead. Xianxia's sea of consciousness was completely gray and cloudy. His damaged soul divine flame was dim, as if it was on the verge of going out, and it was suffused with an icy cold aura. A violet gold imperial sovereign star hung in the air above his soul. However, it was dim and lusterless right now, and it didn't possess even a trace of vitality as well. It seemed like a desolate and dead star. However, the strand of obscure energy seemed to be extremely excited when it noticed all of this, and it trembled without end. It was like an extremely hungry wolf that saw a grand banquet. However, it still seemed extremely vigilant and careful even at a time like this. It observed carefully for a long time before it seemed to have decided. It swiftly flashed towards Xianxia's soul. However, it suddenly stopped when it was halfway there, and then it started to observe carefully again. Obviously, its previous action was clearly a form of probe, and it wanted to use actions to lure out any dangers that may exist. If it wasn't a strand of obscure energy, then one might even wonder whether it was a cunning and skilled hunter who possessed abundant experience. Xianxia's sea of consciousness was completely empty and deathly silent. There was no movement at all. This allowed that strand of obscure energy to finally become resolved. It actually instantly transformed into a strange and warped marking that charged like a bolt of lightning towards Xianxia's soul. Succeeded. At the instant it entered Xianxia's soul, it started to release its might, and it transformed into a terrifying, devouring force that seemed to intend to take possession of Xianxia's dim and seemingly dead soul. However, right at the instant it started to release its might, a strand of mysterious aura suddenly surged into appearance from the depths of Xianxia's soul. It was like a shapeless hand that instantly restrained that obscure strand of energy. After that, the strand of obscure energy seemed as if it was terrified. It suddenly started struggling violently, but it was done in vain in the end. It rumbled as it exploded into pieces, and then it transformed into droplets of light that rained down in Xianxia's soul. At the same time, that strand of mysterious aura had vanished as well. Swish! The droplets of light rained down like a rain of life. As it poured down within Xianxia's dim and seemingly dead soul, it seemed like a wisp of vitality, then created a strand of extremely nourishing energy. In an instant, Xianxia's damaged figure suddenly trembled, and then it fell into death silence once more. But at this moment, it was like a bolt of lightning had struck open Xianxia's consciousness, and it caused him to experience a short moment of consciousness. After that, numerous scenes appeared within his sea of consciousness. There were scenes of the battle with Arui. At that time, Arui had released extremely terrifying and destructive force, and it ceaselessly raged in his body. It made Xianxia feel as if he was on the verge of death. He tried to utilize the energy of Terminus to put an end to the terrifyingly and destructive force. However, it was far from sufficient. He tried to awaken to the river diagram to save him, yet he failed as well. In the end, he thought of samsara, and he thought of how he'd grasped the supreme grand dose of Paramitha, Oblivion, and Terminus. After that, at the instant Xianxia had fused these three divine Tao laws, he instantly felt as if he'd become a completely different person. He had no emotions or distracting thoughts. He was cold and indifferent. He watched as he utilized the Netherworld Register and Condemn Evil Brush like a supreme overlord and successively dispersed Arui's attacks. He watched as he waited for the Netherworld Register to flip to the blank page at the end before he wrote the word, samsara, there. After that, Arui was swept into samsara. His strength, experience, memories, lifespan. Everything was seized from him. In the end, Arui became a young child, and then he transformed further into a drop of dark gold blood. The scene flashed here, and then it became the towering door of the last days. Xianxia saw himself utilize the Condemn Evil Brush to tear apart the gray tribulation lightning that enveloped the door of the last days, and then he saw a row of strange markings of the Tao branded on the surface of the door of the last days. After that, Xianxia saw himself wipe away that row of strange Tao markings with the Condemn Evil Brush, and then he left behind a similar row of strange markings of the Tao. Xianxia had discerned their meaning, yet he was just unable to remember it. It was an extremely conflicting feeling. It caused Xianxia to feel a strand of indescribable displeasure at this moment. Bang! In the next moment, Xianxia's consciousness fell into an unconscious state again, and he lost all of his senses. His body was still damaged and on the verge of breaking apart, and his eyes were still shut tightly. He seemed like a dead person that only had a trace of vitality left. His entire body was immersed within the muddy water and floated erratically, and he was completely unaware of the passage of time. After another unknown period of time, swish! A strand of obscure energy appeared once more. This time it was clearly much stronger and even more careful. Obviously, this strand of obscure energy and the strand of obscure from before had come from the same source. It seemed to be extremely disgruntled by its previous failure, so it had appeared here once more. This time, it surged skillfully into the muddy water and slowly moved along Xianxia's damaged body. All along the way, it didn't encounter any obstruction just like before, and it arrived within Xianxia's sea of consciousness in next to no time. Unlike the first time, it had set its objective onto the extremely dark violet gold Imperial Sovereign Star above the soul of Xianxia's corpse. But in the end, it had still failed. At the instant that it had charged into Xianxia's violet gold Imperial Sovereign Star, it was restrained by a strand of mysterious force, and it didn't even have a chance to struggle before it was crushed into pieces and transformed into a rain of light. In the end, these droplets of light transformed into a strand of vitality that was absorbed by Xianxia's soul. Xianxia's figure shook once more, and he regained momentary consciousness again. This time he recalled the scenes after he entered the door of the last days. It was a gray and misty world that resided within the door of the last days. It seemed to be boundless and endless. It was unimaginably vast, and it was filled with a terrifying aura that could instill fear in the gods and devils of the world. However, before Xianxia could see everything clearly, he'd felt extremely sharp pain throughout his body, and it caused him to seem as if he'd been struck by lightning while his figure crashed downward uncontrollably. In the end, he smashed into a pool of extremely muddy water. He didn't know what the pool was. However, he felt an indescribable feeling of safety when he fell into the pool, and his strained nerves had eased up completely. After that, a strand of irresistible exhaustion surged throughout his heart, and it caused his consciousness to become blurry before he fell into an unconscious state. He was unable to sense anything anymore. At this moment, when he saw all of these scenes, Xianxia suddenly came to an understanding. So, I'm actually on the verge of death now. At this instant, a strand of extremely strong unwillingness suddenly surged out from Xianxia's heart. He wasn't willing to die just like that. He wanted to wake Xin Luqing up, he wanted to get his parents back, he wanted to crush the sovereign sect. There were too many things that he wanted to do. So, how could he die just like this? No, I can't die. Xianxia shouted in his heart while an extremely strong desire to live arose in his heart. He tried hard to make himself maintain his consciousness. He worked hard to awaken the vital energy throughout his body. He worked hard to. In the end, Xianxia felt a wave of sharp pain from his sea of consciousness. And then his consciousness was covered in a dark shadow before he fell unconscious once more. However, Xianxia hadn't noticed at all that his originally deathly silent soul was suffused with a trace of bright light now. Even though it was faint and extremely inconspicuous, it really existed in the end. At the same time, the last trace of extremely weak vital energy within his body actually seemed to have been invigorated. It stopped being intermittent, and it started to circulate incessantly throughout the damaged meridians and apertures in his body. Regretfully, the damage suffered by his meridians and apertures were too severe. They seemed to be in a complete mess. So, merely a strand of vital energy would take countless years to full repair Xianxia's body. Swish! After an unknown period of time, another strand of obscure energy appeared once more. Just like the last two, it came from the same source. However, unlike the last two, the obscure energy seemed extremely violent, vast, and powerful this time. It was more than 10 times stronger than before. As soon as it appeared here, it transformed into a myriad of finer strands of energy. It was like it had instantly divided itself into a myriad of clones. In the end, it transformed into a vast and mighty army that surged soundlessly into the muddy pool of water and shot towards Xianxia's body. The myriad of fine strands of obscure energy seemed like the tentacles of an octopus as they surged into Xianxia's body, and then they moved incessantly along his bones and apertures. They moved swiftly all along the way in an aggressive manner, and it was completely different to how cautiously they'd acted for the last two times. They seemed to be very confident that their formidable strength would be sufficient for them to smoothly attack and capture the target. As the obscure energy started to surge into his body, Xianxia's body started to tremble noticeably, and it seemed like he's instinctively sensed danger. This time, a strand of mysterious fluctuation had suddenly effused out from the depths of Xianxia's soul before they could even enter Xianxia's sea of consciousness. In an instant, it transformed into a huge net that completely enveloped the obscure energy that were charging towards Xianxia's sea of consciousness. Rumble! The two completely different forces entered into battle within Xianxia's body, and they fought ceaselessly like fire and water. It was an extremely terrifying sight. This scene was inconceivable indeed. No matter if it was the obscure energy that surged over from the outside world or the mysterious fluctuation that came from the depths of Xianxia's soul, both of them carried extremely terrifying auras that were extremely rare in the entire world yet completely different. So, as soon as they started fighting, they caused extremely great destruction to Xianxia's already tattered body. Pooh! 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 During the following period of time, blood was noticeably erupting from every single inch of Xianxia's body from time to time, and it was a horrifying sight. If such a situation were to continue, then Xianxia's entire body would explode into pieces before the outcome of their battle was determined. But it just so happened that Xianxia seemed to be completely unaware of everything during such an extremely dangerous moment, and he remained in that unconscious state from before. The muddy pool of water started to turn dark red while bubbles gurgled from within it, and the bubbles were dyed with trace of a bloody glow. It wasn't long before it seemed like the pool was boiling, and it had transformed into a pool of blood, whereas Xianxi's extremely damaged body floated within it, causing this scene to seem extremely horrifying. Bang! Suddenly, Xianxi's entire body stiffened before his entire body besides his head exploded into pieces, and it transformed pieces of flesh and blood that became a part of the muddy pool of blood. At the same time, the strands of obscure aura were like sharp blades and had charged into Xianxi's sea of consciousness. They were charging madly to assault Xianxi's soul. Danger! A strand of lethal danger swept through Xianxi. If the obscure energy were to succeed in its objective, then it would probably be eternally impossible for Xianxi to come back to life. Right at this instant, the image of the river diagram fragments had appeared in his sea of consciousness, and they emanated a strand of strange fluctuations. At practically the exact same moment, an ethereal image of a brush and book appeared along with the river diagram fragments. Surprisingly, it was the energy of the Netherworld Register and Condemn Evil Brush. In other words, the energy of these three mysterious treasures, the river diagram fragments, the Netherworld Register, and the Condemn Evil Brush, had appeared within Xianxi's sea of consciousness. That's a voice that was surprised and furious resounded from the strands of obscure energy. After that, those strands of obscure energy exploded into pieces and transformed into a rain of light while that furious and shocked voice vanished. All of this occurred in an instant that was inconceivably swift, and the scenes that had appeared were unimaginable and astounding. If it was any other person, that person would probably be unable to imagine exactly what formidable existence had sent those strands of obscure energy because it was actually capable of forcing the river diagram fragments, the Netherworld Register, and the Condemn Evil Brush to act jointly in order to crush it. However, this wasn't the end of everything. After those strands of obscure energy were crushed and transformed into a rain of light, regardless of whether it was the river diagram fragments, the Netherworld Register, or the Condemn Evil Brush, all of them hadn't vanished and continued to emanate fluctuations instead. At this moment, the entire muddy pool of blood was boiling and rumbling, while strands of mysterious energy emerged from the pool of blood and converged together. Xianxi was still completely unaware of all of this. It was even to the extent that he wasn't even aware that he only had a head now. Along with the passage of time, the pool of blood boiled even more vigorously, while the accumulated mysterious energy grew stronger and stronger. It was an astonishing sight. Rumble. In the end, thunderous lightning, raging wind, flowing rays of blood, and various other terrifying phenomena had appeared in the sky above the pool of blood, and it threw the surroundings in the chaos. It was even to the extent that numerous chaotic lotus flowers had appeared in the gray and hazy sky. All of them were formed from supreme profundities of the Grand Tao, and they descended down and floated into the pool of blood. Such phenomena could be described to be world-shocking and unimaginable, because the energies within them were too mysterious and not energy that could be possessed in the outside world. They could only be seen within the door of the last days. Along with the passage of time, the lightning grew more and more turbulent. The entire sky was covered in terrifying gray lightning, and it enveloped this entire area. The chaotic lotus flowers of the Grand Tao seemed infinite as they descended incessantly into the boiling pool of blood, and they fused with the blood to transform into the purest form of energy and were nourished within the pool. After an unknown period of time, an ethereal body could be clearly seen to have appeared beneath Xianxi's head. Streams of blood converged in the body, threads of mysterious energy seethed within it, and pure strands of the aura of the Grand Tao enshrouded it. They started to fuse in a unique manner and pulse incessantly. It was like they were breathing, and their rhythm was slow and profound. The blood was formed from Xianxi's original body that had exploded into flesh and blood. The threads of mysterious energy and the aura of the Grand Tao came from the lotus flowers of the Grand Tao that descended from the sky, and the strange fluctuations emanated by the river diagram fragments, the Netherworld Register, and the Condemn Evil Brush. Presently, all of these forces were fusing together to remold Xianxi's body. It seemed extremely inconceivable. Time flowered by swiftly. Xianxi's seemingly ethereal body had started to gradually become material, and it seemed like he was undergoing a transformation akin to rebirth. This transformation was completely out of Xianxia's control, and it was triggered by a string of variables. It was even to the extent that Xianxia himself was completely unaware of it. At this moment, he was still in that unconscious state. His consciousness was blurry, and he was completely unaware of everything that was occurring in the outside world. In the end, the lightning that covered the sky, the violent gales that raged through the air, the blood-red glow that streamed down like a storm, and the lotus flowers of the Grand Tao that floated down from the sky, all of them had started to gradually weaken before vanishing in the end. The world returned to its gray and hazy state from before, and it was completely deathly silent. Even the pool of blood had stopped boiling and transformed into a muddy color once more. The only different thing was Xianxia. At this moment, he possessed a practically flawless body. His skin was clear and translucent like jade or glass, and it was suffused with a divine glow of the Tao and possessed copious vitality that was vast like an ocean. If one looked carefully, the striations on every single inch of his skin seemed like the marks of the Grand Tao. They were filled with a mysterious aura of the Tao and emanated divine radiance that revealed boundless profundities. Laying eyes on these striations was like gazing upon the true Grand Tao, and if one comprehended it carefully, then one could even comprehend all sorts of profundities from them. All of this had transformed into a part of Xianxia's body. It was simply like the Grand Tao had become the base of his body, and his body was like a marvel of nature. On the other hand, every single inch of the tendons and bones within his body seemed as if they were made out of jade, and they were dazzling and resplendent. If one were to strike them, they would even emanate the tune of the Grand Tao that sounded like the morning bell, and it contained boundless mysterious energy. Besides that, the essence, energy, and spirit in his body seethed and surged, and they were dyed in a layer of seemingly material violet gold color. Moreover, they circulated incessantly within his body as if they were carrying out a perfect cycle of the Grand Tao. Bang! Besides that, numerous universes floated while a myriad of stars circulated in the boundlessly vast, brilliant, and divine region within Xianxia's body. Entering the region within Xianxia's body was like arriving at a real region. It was filled with the order of the divine Tao, and thick divine energy converged endlessly within it. When compared to before, Xianxia's entire body was simply brand new, and it had undergone a tremendous transformation. Everything was moving and improving towards a perfect state. On the other hand, Xianxia's soul divine flame within his sea of consciousness had been lit ablaze once more, and it blazed brilliantly like eternal light. The violet gold imperial sovereign star was like a scorching sun above Xianxia's soul. It glowed brilliantly and even illuminated his entire sea of consciousness, causing his entire soul to be illuminated and glistening. Everything seemed as if they'd attained new life. At an unknown moment in time, the river diagram fragments, the netherworld register, and the condemn evil brush had all vanished from Xianxia's sea of consciousness and fell to deathly silence. But up until now, Xianxia's consciousness still showed no signs of awakening, and this seemed extremely strange. He'd clearly undergone a world-shocking transformation throughout his body, and it was like he'd been reborn and was more than 2 times stronger than before. However, it just so happened that Xianxia's consciousness seemed as if it wasn't able to obtain any strength from this transformation, and it was still in a dazed and unconscious state. Time flowed by swiftly like an arrow, and another 10 years of time had quickly passed since Xianxia's entire body had undergone that transformation. During these 10 years of time, Xianxia still hadn't awakened, and his entire body floated in the muddy pool as if he was dead. However, during these 10 years of time, an entire 2 violet gold imperial sovereign stars had appeared above his soul divine flame. In other words, if it was merely based on his cultivation alone, then Xianxia was currently a 3rd-star region lord. If he was in the outside world, then such a shocking speed of advancement would definitely astound the other region lords. The most absurd part was that Xianxia hadn't cultivated at all, and all of this had occurred naturally. It was even to the extent that he wasn't aware that he was a 3rd-star region lord now. This wasn't just absurd, it was even to the extent that no one would believe such a tale. However, all of this had occurred behind the mysterious door of the last days, so if one thought about the numerous world-shocking legends about this door, then the change that Xianxia experienced weren't so surprising. In 10 years of time, Xianxia's cultivation had risen by 2 levels, but he still wasn't able to awaken, and his entire body floated in the muddy pool as if he would never be able to awaken. It was also on this very year that a hunched and aged figure walked over from the gray and hazy world in the distance. His entire body was enveloped beneath a black robe, while he held a dark wooden cane in his hand as he staggered forward, and every single step he took seemed to be extremely difficult. However, every single step he took seemed as if it passed through boundless space and the annals of time. There was no force that could obstruct him. In the blink of an eye, he'd arrived before the muddy pool. His dark and cold gaze was like a bolt of lightning as it shot through his black robe and descended onto Xianxia, who was floating in the muddy pool. The reflection of the hunched and aged figure that was enveloped by a black robe appeared on the water in the pool, and half a thin and blurry face appeared there. He supported himself on a pitch-black wooden stick and emanated a mysterious aura as his gaze that was dark and cold like lightning stared at Xianxia for a long time before he suddenly raised his right hand. His hand was emaciated and long, with fingers that were like bamboos, and the nerves on the back of his palm seemed to coil about like worms. It seemed extremely old. On the other hand, there was a mysterious tattoo on his palm. The tattoo was like a character written with dense strokes, and it was unlike any type of writing in the world. It was extremely mysterious, and it was suffused with a horrifying glow. A strand of divine light shot out from the tattoo on his palm. It was like a blade as it slashed through space and slashed apart the muddy water in the pool as it descended forcefully towards Xianxia's body. This attack wasn't terrifying, but it revealed a terrifying aura of absolute power. It seemed like Xianxia's body would be mercilessly split into 2 in the next moment. However, a strange scene appeared. As soon as that divine light approached Xianxia's body, it seemed like a clay ox that had fallen into an ocean. Not only was it unable to harm Xianxia, it was swallowed by his body and vanished soundlessly. As expected, the black-robed man muttered with a voice that carried boundless age and experience. Bang! He seemed to refuse to give up, and then a strand of terrifying and monstrous aura seethed from his entire body before he made a grabbing motion towards Xianxia with his slender and emaciated palm. It was like a large net that intended to grab all the fist within the pool. Bang! Water sprayed as his hand forcefully grabbed a hold of Xianxia's neck, and then he suddenly raised his hand with the intention of dragging Xianxia out of the water. However, right at this instant, a strand of powerful and mysterious energy erupted from within Xianxia's motionless body. Bang! The black-robed man felt a wave of sharp pain sweep through his right arm, while an extremely terrifying force invaded his body. It was like a wild beast had bitten him, and he wasn't able to struggle free of the wild beast. It was even to the extent that he couldn't even resist it. The mysterious energy was too terrifying. No matter how black-robed man struggled, he was actually unable to escape it while it ceaselessly invaded his body instead. No! How could this be possible? We're all saviors. But why was he able to bring the river diagram into the door of the last days? The black-robed man howled with extreme shock and rage, and he seemed as if he'd encountered something that was extremely terrifying. His voice surged through the surroundings, and it caused one's heart to palpitate in fear. It was clearly visible that while the black-robed man's right hand was still holding Xianxia's neck, his body was trembling violently and uncontrollably as if he was enduring extreme pain. Damn it! How many years has it been? Could it be that I'm going to be destroyed at the hands of someone who came after me? The black-robed man howled incessantly. Even the black robe that enveloped his entire body had ripped apart to reveal an extremely thin figure. His long hair was white and hung loosely on his shoulders. His face was aged and covered densely in wrinkles, and only his eyes were bright like the sun and flowed with strands of the aura of experience and age. His imposing aura was extremely outstanding. It carried an extraordinary, ancient, and primitive aura. His entire body emanated an indescribably supreme aura. However, at this moment, he'd revealed a shocking and furious expression. Even his eyes were filled with astonishment while his entire body trembled. It was like he was shackled and unable to struggle free. The mysterious energy was still spreading incessantly and charged into the old man's body with ease before it continued spreading and was on the verge of covering his entire body. This isn't the energy of the river diagram. Suddenly, the old man seemed to have noticed something, and he howled furiously in a hysterical voice. He seemed as if he'd encountered the most terrifying thing in the world. The heavens and the earth shook while the gray and hazy sky was suffused with a terrifying and suffocating aura. At the side of the muddy pool, the old man's figure was trembling as his furious howls shook the sky. However, Xianxia seemed as if he hadn't noticed at all and seemed like a dead person that had vitality in his body. These scenes seemed so horrifying, and they carried a strange aura. Bang! In the end, the old man somehow mustered up the strength to suddenly wave the black stick in his left hand and struck it forcefully against his right arm. Crack! His right arm exploded into pieces and transformed into powder, whereas he seemed like a kite that had escaped the restraints of its string and crashed to the ground behind him. Pooh! He coughed up a large mouthful of blood, and his body twitched as he lay on the ground. Moreover, a wisp of horror from escaping death still hung on his face. He seemed to be in an extremely sorry state. At this moment, he was simply like an old man that only had a short time left to live, and he wasn't imposing anymore at all. Damn it! I never expected that a freak who's so difficult to deal with would actually appear during this era. What exactly was that energy? Why was it able to suppress all my ability? The old man lied on the ground while he gasped for breath, and his expression changed indeterminately. Moreover, a wisp of surprise and bewilderment that couldn't be eliminated resided in the space between his brows. In the end, he struggled to stand up, and then he laughed sorrowfully because he'd noticed that more than half of his strength had actually been obliterated. He was already heavily injured and on the verge of death. It was obvious how severe the consequences would be if he didn't recuperate as soon as possible. That damnable freak! The old man glanced at Xianxia, who was still floating in the pool, and he seemed to be extremely disgruntled and unwilling. However, he still gritted his teeth and staggered off in the end. Stop right there! Suddenly, a cold and indifferent voice resounded from behind the old man, and it caused his figure to stiffen. After that, he seemed like a ferocious beast that had been provoked. A terrifying aura surged throughout his entire body as he suddenly blasted through space with the intention of flashing towards the distance. However, right at the instant that he'd started moving, a hand that was condensed from violet gold divine radiance appeared out of thin air, and then it forcefully grabbed his neck and then dragged him back. Thump! The old man was smashed to the ground, causing him to feel dizzy and become covered in dust. He was in an extremely sorry state. He raised his head with difficulty, and then he saw a tall figure was suddenly standing at the side of the muddy pool. That freak is awake? The old man muttered in his heart before his gaze moved upward to see the tall figure's face clearly. The tall figure had a handsome appearance, dense black hair, deep and indifferent eyes, and his entire body seemed as if it was formed from the Grand Tao. As he stood there casually, he emanated an indescribably imposing aura that seemed immovable. This is that freak who has been unconscious until now? In an instant, his expression changed once more, and his gaze flickered indeterminately. Where is this place? The tall figure was naturally Xianxia. His consciousness had awakened when he was held by the throat just now. No one knows, but you can call it the land of catastrophe. At this moment, the old man seemed to be extremely calm. He took a deep breath before he crawled up from the ground and sat where he was. After that, he gazed at Xianxia with a wisp of a complicated expression that was impossible to conceal. The last of catastrophe, Xianxia muttered. He placed his hands behind his back as he swept the surroundings with his gaze, but he was only able to see a gray and hazy world. It seemed like it was in a chaotic state, and he was unable to discern how large it was. Xianxia withdrew his gaze before he gazed at the old man. Who are you? I'm just like you, the old man said, Of course, you can call me shaman. He seemed to be aware that he was unable to do anything to Xianxia, so he seemed extremely cooperative. Shaman. Xianxia glanced at him and said, "So, in this way, you're the savior from the last era that entered the door of the last days?" Shaman nodded. Exactly. He seemed to be unsurprised that Xianxia had instantly guessed that. On the other hand, Xianxia's heart was in slight disorder when he heard Shaman's answer. After a moment of silence, he said, "Do you know that it was exactly because you opened the door of the last days during the last era that the last era was obliterated?" Shaman nodded and said casually, "I do. This is a general movement of events in the world, and it can't be stopped. Even if I didn't open it, it would be opened by someone else." As he spoke, he raised his head to gaze at Xianxia, and then a wisp of a strange arc arose on the corners of his mouth. "Aren't you the same?" Xianxia didn't know why he had such a feeling, but he shook his head in a practically instinctive manner and said, "You're wrong. I'm not like you. The era I came from will definitely not suffer the calamity of the last days." "Oh!" Shaman started laughing, and his laughter carried pity in it. "There's no need to lie to yourself. Saviors aren't the cause of an era's destruction." Xianxia glanced at Shaman yet didn't argue with him, and then Xianxia changed the topic. "I heard that besides containing the energy of the calamity of the last days that can obliterate an era, this place also hides the true secrets of the ultimate path towards the Tao." Before he could finish speaking, Shaman interrupted him and said, "The ultimate path towards the Tao? I've been searching this place for countless years, yet I've come back empty-handed until now. In the end, I finally realized that all of that was a lie. The ultimate path towards the Tao? It's sheer fiction. It doesn't exist in the world at all." As he finished speaking, Shaman revealed an agitated expression, and it seemed like the hatred he'd endured for countless years had erupted at this moment. Xianxia gazed calmly at Shaman, and he waited until Shaman calmed down before he said, "Then do you know how to leave this place?" Shaman was stunned, and then he roared with ridiculing laughter and said, "If it was possible to leave, then I would have left this damnable place a long time ago. How could I have stayed here until now?" Xianxia fell silent again, and then he suddenly said, "During these years that I was unconscious, it was you who successively attempted to swallow my soul and occupy my body, right?" Shaman's entire body stiffened, and then his expression changed indeterminately before he nodded in the end and said, "Yes." He was very clearly aware that the current situation didn't allow him to deny it at all, so it was better to admit it because it might help have a chance at survival. "Why?" asked Xianxia. Moreover, he showed no sign of attacking Shaman. This allowed Shaman to heave a sigh of relief in his heart, and then thought for a moment before he said, "I heard that every single savior has a unique era brand. So long as I'm able to refine and absorb all of them, then I would have a very good chance at obtaining." When he spoke up to hear, Shaman started hesitating. "Obtain what?" She gazed calmly at Shaman with an indifferent and tranquil expression. Shaman gritted his teeth before he lightly spat out a few words. "The true secrets of the ultimate path towards the Tao." A wisp of surprise suffused Xianxia's eyes. "Didn't you say that you didn't believe the ultimate path towards the Tao exists? Or perhaps you were lying just now?" Shaman shook his head repeatedly and said, "After staying at this damnable place for so long, I had to find hope that would keep me going. Otherwise, I would be too miserable." His voice carried a wisp of boundless sorrow. "Miserable?" Xianxia was indifferent towards this. He was thinking about Shaman's words. "I can obtain the true secrets of the ultimate path towards the Tao by refining and absorbing the brands possessed by the other saviors? Is that really true? There's no heaven Tao or any laws in the land of catastrophe. There's only deathly silence and emptiness." Suddenly Shaman muttered with a dazed expression, "In the future, you'll notice how boring, lonely, and miserable living here is. But you can only endure it all for the sake of survival." Xianxia frowned but didn't interrupt Shaman. "Unfortunately, even with all the ability I possess, I can only remain exiled here like a prisoner that's unable to escape this cage. It's even to the extent that it's difficult to even find someone to speak to." Shaman's voice was low, bleak, and carried a strand of indescribable sorrow. If I knew this would have happened, I would have preferred to perish along with that era than come to this place. When he spoke up to hear, Shaman gazed at Xianxia, and then he suddenly revealed a wisp of a ridiculing smile. Perhaps you're unable to understand all of this, but you'll understand in the future. I'm even sure that you have no choice but to aimlessly endure this sort of misery and torture like we have. We? Xianxia acutely noticed this word, and he said, "There are others here?" Shaman nodded and said, "Of course. Could it be that you're unaware that a total of 8 eras have been obliterated in the annals of time until now? The destruction of 8 eras meant that there were 8 saviors who had arrived inside the door of the last days. Xianxia was naturally clearly aware of this. In other words, you're the 9th savior who has arrived here." Shaman's voice carried a wisp of pity as he spoke these words. Xianxia remained silent for a moment before he asked in a direct manner, "Where are the others?" Every single savior has their own territory, and they would absolutely not leave their territory under normal circumstances. When he spoke up to hear, Shaman pointed at the muddy pool and said, "Look, that's your territory, and my territory is outside that pool." Xianxia was stunned, and then he frowned and said, "How are territories divided?" Shaman instantly fell silent. Xianxia seemed to have understood something when he witnessed this, and he seemed to be lost in thought. Looks like strength is required to possess a larger territory. Indeed, the land of catastrophe was too mysterious. Even Shaman didn't know its origins and could only call it the land of catastrophe. At the same time, this place didn't have a heaven Tao or any laws. It was like a desolate place, so it was naturally without any rules. Since there were no rules, then strength replaced the effect of rules. "You intend to seize my territory?" Shaman raised his head and couldn't help but ask this question. Moreover, he seemed to be slightly nervous. "No, I don't intend to stay here forever." Xianxia shook his head and spoke with a flat voice that carried an indisputable tone. However, when these words entered into Shaman's ears, it caused him to laugh with ridicule. "It's impossible. The 8 of us have endured countless years of time and practically searched this entire place. However, we were unable to escape in the end. So, do you think you have any chance of leaving?" His voice even carried a trace of ridicule. "How would I know without giving it a try?" said Xianxia in an indifferent tone. "Then what do you intend to do?" The ridicule on his face grew even denser, and he seemed as if he was waiting to laugh at Xianxia. "I'm going to do as you said." Xianxia gazed at Shaman with a composed expression, and it seemed as if he didn't possess any emotions. "What I said." Shaman was stunned, and then he seemed to have realized something, causing his expression to change greatly. Bang! Before he could react, his entire body was enveloped by a strand of terrifying violet gold divine radiance. "No! Why? Why?" Shaman let out an extremely miserable and shrill cry that surged with hatred. In the end, his entire body rumbled as it exploded into pieces, and then it transformed into an extremely mysterious symbol. It was in the form of a character that represented Shaman. However, the strokes that it was made up of were extremely dense. It seemed like they contained boundless profundities and possessed a unique aura. During this entire process, Xianxia had constantly remained silent while his expression didn't change at all. Up until the point he saw this mysterious character symbol did a wisp of surprise appear in his eyes, and then he opened his mouth and swallowed it. Bang! In an instant, it felt like an extremely vast secrets of inheritance erupted within him and surged into his sea of consciousness, and then it transformed into numerous comprehensions that entered his heart. In his days, it was like he saw a grand era, and it was the Shaman era. During that era, the myriad of living beings in the era cultivated in the Shaman Tao, and they searched for the method to gain eternal life. They were called warrior shamans, spirit shamans, master shamans, grandmaster shamans, saint shamans, divine shamans, holy shamans, king shamans. It was a civilization that belonged completely to the shaman. They tempered their bodies and vital blood, and they took the path of immortality through the body. The aura of the entire shaman era was branded in the mysterious Symbol. It floated in Xianxia's sea of consciousness, and it was ceaselessly emanating fluctuations. This symbol was the shaman seal. It represented the unique aura possessed by the entire shaman era and its unique inheritance. It wasn't exaggerated to say that so long as Xianxia completely refined it, then he could gain insight into the entire civilization and inheritance of the shaman era. However, Xianxia restrained such thoughts of his in the end. He returned to the side of the muddy pool, and then he sat cross-legged. Only after then did a wisp of a dazed expression appear on his tranquil and handsome face. He recalled how he arrived here, he recalled how he fell unconscious, and he even recalled everything that occurred to him throughout these years. But up until this very moment when he faced all of this wide awake, Xianxia finally noticed that all of this was like a dream, and it was so unreal. He couldn't figure out why he would act arbitrarily and open the door of the last days. He was unable to figure out what exactly the row of strange words branded on the door of the last days represented, or why he wiped away those words with the condemn evil brush and then left behind a row of strange words that even he couldn't understand. Similarly, during the years that he was unconscious in the muddy water, he didn't know why his body had undergone such a tremendous transformation. Moreover, it wasn't just his body that had been remodeled and transformed, even his cultivation had risen to the 3rd star of the imperial monarch realm in one go. All of this seemed extremely inconceivable. It was completely out of Xianxia's control. So, besides feeling worried, he even felt horrified when he recalled all of it. This feeling of losing control made him worry that he would lose himself one day and become a completely unfamiliar and different form of himself. Xianxia detested such a feeling. The river diagram, the netherworld register, the condemn evil brush, samsara, the door of the last days. Exactly what sort of secret is hidden behind all of this? After a long time passed, Xianxia couldn't help but sigh. He was even clearly aware that if Shaman wasn't heavily injured just now, then he would be utterly unable to kill Shaman by relying on his own strength. No! How could this be possible? We're all saviors. But why was he able to bring the river diagram into the door of the last days? This isn't the energy of the river diagram. Shaman's extremely terrifying howl seemed to resound by his ears. All of this allowed Xianxia to roughly determine that it was either the river diagram or the energy of samsara that heavily injured Shaman. When he thought up to here, Xianxia couldn't help but mutter, "Right, why was I able to bring the river diagram in here with me?" The last 8 eras had been destroyed because the saviors of those eras had entered the door of the last days. The reason they were able to accomplish this was because they possessed the river diagram. In other words, every single one of the saviors, including Shaman, had been comprehenders of the river diagram. However, if it was based on this, then once those saviors opened the door of the last days, the river diagram would be left outside the door of the last days. Otherwise, how could it have been passed down continuously until now? So, if Xianxia's inference wasn't wrong, then the river diagram had been passed down for 9 eras now. Under such circumstances, it just so happened that he'd brought the river diagram with him into the door of the last days, and he hadn't lost it outside the door. This was clearly unusual. Perhaps it's because my river diagram is incomplete, so I was able to accomplish this? A thought arose inadvertently in Xianxia's mind. The river diagram he possessed right now wasn't complete. He still lacked a piece in order to fully complete it. But if it was like that, then how could an incomplete river diagram open the door of the last days? Was it samsara? A wisp of a bright light arose in Xianxia's eyes. Up until now, he was still unable to figure all of this out. However, he was sure that the unusual events that occurred to him were definitely linked to the energy of samsara that he possessed. Just think about it, a comprehender of the river diagram that possessed an incomplete river diagram and the energy of samsara. Just this seemed extremely shocking and extremely unusual. Perhaps it was precisely because of this unusualness that this string of unexpected events had occurred to Xianxia. Xianxia took a deep breath, stood up, discerned his directions, and then flashed towards the gray and hazy world in the distance. Shaman had said that so long as he refined and absorbed the era brands possessed by the others, then there was a chance for him to comprehend the true secrets of the ultimate path towards the Tao. Now, even though Xianxia had annihilated shaman and obtained the seal of the shaman, he still couldn't confirm this. However, he intended to give it a try. He wasn't just doing it for the sake of the true secrets of the ultimate path towards the Tao. He was also doing it for the sake of leaving this place. 7 days later, a grand, lofty, and seemingly boundless city had appeared in the gray and hazy world in the distance. It was like an ancient rock that was nested there, and it emanated a strand of monstrous aura. A city? Xianxia's eyes narrowed, and he stood silently on the spot. After he obtained the seal of the shaman, Xianxia had obtained some of shaman's memories as well, so he'd recognized this grand city with a single glance. It was the martial emperor's city. This was a world that was personally created by the seventh savior. Entering the city was no different than entering a territory controlled by the seventh savior, and he would suffer merciless attacks from the seventh savior and might even lose his life.